Can you guys hear me okay? It's good? Cool. First of all, how about we give a hand of applause to Optimal Workshop, Andrew, Jimmy, Matt, the volunteers, the caterers. This is a fantastic, fantastic event, so thanks, guys. Also, you guys have a beautiful country. I happened to be down in the South Island for about 3 weeks and just kind of tramping over 200K, and wow, you guys are lucky, that's all I gotta say. Before I start, if anybody's here thinking that this is a talk about design at British Airways, it's not it. So, there's coffee and dessert and, it's all good. This talk is actually about designers and business analysts. So before I start, are there any business analysts in the audience? Wow, cool. Are there any designers in the audience that think that they do stuff that business analysts do? Oh, more hands. Are there any BAs that think that they do things that UX designers do? Oh, even less. Interesting. Okay. So the title of the talk, obviously you recognize it as a play on words on the title of a book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which was written in 1992 by Dr. John Gray. And the thing about that book that's interesting is that it's become the #1 best-selling nonfiction book of the 90s. It sold over 50 million copies. Now, the other interesting thing about that book is that even though it was a huge commercial success, it was widely criticized by academia for trivializing the relationship psychology between men and women. So I figured, what better title for a 40-minute talk that's going to trivialize the relationship psychology between BAs and designers. We've heard a lot about getting to the table today, And that's sort of an interesting concept because if you're a designer, chances are that you work for a company and you're immersed within a project. Chances are that this is not the view that you think you're in every single day. So I think the focus, as Paul was mentioning in his talk, should change a little bit from, designers trying to get immediately to sort of leadership positions to designers actually starting to understand what it is that it takes to get to those leadership positions. When I talk to students and when I talk to sort of new entrants in our field, people who want to switch to being a designer, they usually ask me 2 questions. First one is, how do I get a job as a UX designer? And we know there's no answer for that. And the second one is, what do I wish I knew when I was young, so 20 years ago when I started my career, that I know now that would really help me in my career? And the answer to that is that I think that there's not a lot of emphasis on the fact that design is politics. So we hear a lot about designers as movie directors and architects, right? This is how we like to kind of see ourselves, as chefs, right? We like to see ourselves as in charge of the environment that we do our work in. But the truth is, we're more like politicians, right? What we're doing is we're trying to create something, but we spend a lot of time, and we need to get much better at convincing the people that we work with that the things that we're doing are the right things, and we need to get buy-in, and we need to get support from those guys to actually push these things through. If you think about it, just like politics, right? Whether it's business, whether it's stakeholders, whether it's marketing, whether it's communications, whether it's SMEs, everybody brings their own bias, everybody brings their own subjectivity and their own opinion when they look at design deliverables. That doesn't happen with almost anything else in the business world today. But we are special that way. So we need to convince all these guys that what we do is the right thing. Now, when I say design is politics, I don't mean necessarily design in politics, right? So you guys have gone through this. I found this quite fascinating last year. This is not what I'm going to be talking about today. Another thing is project managers. So when you talk to project managers about what their biggest hiring challenge is when it comes to hiring young designers or sort of designers starting into their design career, they complain about designers not knowing how to work with other disciplines. So in design school, you don't learn about how you're going to work with business analysts, for example, right? You learn maybe a little bit how to work with developers, because that's something that, as you work on sort of term projects, that's something that you kind of get a little bit of exposure to. But when it comes to, working with business analysts, working with the business, that's something that's not quite developed. Companies right now, they're getting so desperate about hiring the right designers that they're doing things like this. They're actually hiring entire teams. They're trying to bypass the whole, can this person work with my existing team, or can this person work with the other people I'm trying to hire? I'm going to hire an entire team that already knows how to work with each other, and therefore bypass that entirely. So it's a real problem, right? Now, as we saw in Phil's opening presentation today, I wish we had this. Right? How cool would it be if we just kind of sit people in the Neuralign device and we say, okay, this BA can work with this designer, they can work with this developer, good, done, right? Maybe in the whole speculative future, maybe that's something that's going to happen. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. Now, how many of you here work on sort of small projects or startups? Show of hands. Cool. How many of you work on sort of large projects, enterprise scale, government? Okay, cool. So you're my kind of people. This is, when you look at how money and work is allocated on small scale projects, and this is true for small startups, this is true for sort of bigger companies that work on sort of a smaller thing. The front end of the process, which is business modeling and specifications, is ignored largely because people think they can manage that piece fairly easily during the design stage. So the focus is much on what we do: user research, IA, prototyping, and actually visual design, getting really quickly to that MVP, right? That's what all startups want to get to, want to do, right? They want to get to that MVP really quickly, and they don't care much about, how much business work they're going to do up front. Now, when we switch to enterprise and large-scale projects, the situation changes significantly, right? So if you think about what business analysis work is, on a small scale, there's very little of it. On big projects, there's actually more of it done up front than it is, the work that we do as designers sort of further down the road. So that is why I think there's sort of a bit more education needed on how to work with BAs and how to make sure that we are fully compatible with the teams that we're a part of. Now, when I do this talk and I finish it, people usually come to me and say, well, this totally makes sense, but what I don't understand is how you expect us to be able to work with them and have sort of the same rights, for the lack of a better word, in a team as BAs, since BAs have been around for so much longer and we're such a young discipline, right? This is what Natalie was saying earlier as well. We're such a young discipline. Well, if you guys know anything about the history of design or the history of business, we're not a young discipline at all. We've actually been around for a very, very long time. So I don't take that as a real explanation. So since people don't seem to know much about the history of BA and UX, I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute primer on what that is. I'm going to make a parallel. It's going to be, top line is going to be design history, bottom line is going to be BA history. So the first thing to talk about is, this is on the BA side, by the way, Greek philosopher Aristotle. He's the first person that came up with the theories on departmentalization of labor. He actually hated the whole idea about these theories, like he was against them, but he's the first person that came up with this kind of stuff, which is similar with the way BAs map business processes to roles today. On the design side, we have Marcus Vitruvius. He lived in, like you see, in the 1st century BC. And how many of you are familiar with Vitruvius? Oh, cool. Yeah, that's pretty good. He's a Roman architect. He wrote the only surviving classical antiquity architecture book until today called De Architectura, and in that book, he defined sort of what is called today as the Vitruvian triad, which are the three principles that guide designing something. Typically, it's architecture related, but it's actually applicable to this day. So he was saying that something has to be strong, something has to be useful, and something has to be beautiful. Those are the three rules that he came up with. Now, if you think about today, those rules are still fully applicable, especially if you would build physical products, right? So to me, he's the first UX designer, so to speak. There we go. Now I'm going to jump about 1,000 years, and we're going to go to Da Vinci. So the Renaissance movement, people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo, they sort of moved design a little bit further on with a lot of sort of fantastic work when it comes to typography, sketching, industrial design. And all these guys were actually big disciples of Vitruvius. So much so that in Da Vinci's case, he drew what's widely known as the Vitruvian Man. So it's a tribute to Vitruvius and Vitruvius's idea about design. On the business side, we have British economist Adam Smith, who actually described the business process required to create a pin factory. And if you know anything about Adam Smith, so he's sort of the father of modern economy, market economy, but this is his map, right? I don't know about you, but this guy can draw better than I can, right? And think about it, this is like the first, as far as I know, this is sort of like the first polished journey map that's out there in the world. So it's actually pretty impressive. Moving on, we've got Friedrich Winslow Taylor, the American engineer that actually invented Taylorism. So he's the first guy that actually started working with workflows. Again, something that business analysts work on tirelessly today. And that's sort of early 19th century. Early 20th century. And then on the design side, we're finally starting to talk about modern things, right? So the first thing is human factors. As human factors are today, we tend to use human factors for a lot of sort of noble causes, right? But the thing is, human factors came out of the design of military equipment in the First World War. So our beginnings as a modern discipline, not quite as honorable as we think. 1968, IBM, Amdahl et al., and Richard Saul Wurman finally coined the term IA as we know it today by adding concepts from library science to sort of data structures. And that's sort of the first mention of information architecture. And then in 1971, I know I have to be close to this thing. 1971, the microprocessor was invented. So this was a big step in both BA history and design history. And the reason for that is that it gave birth to sort of the first modern analysts as we know them today, right? So originally they were data analysts or systems analysts, and they are the first version of the BAs as we know them today. At the same time, in 1984, Don Norman coined the first user experience, and that's why I think most people think the user experience is a new discipline. I disagree. And then as we go forward, Jesse James Garrett, the elements of user experience, which is sort of the first visual representation of the elements that make up the discipline as we know it today. And 2004, this is on the BA side. We have, come on. Oh. There we go. 2004, we have the International Institute of Business Analysis being created, and the first version of what is called the BA Book of Knowledge, or the BOK, as everybody affectionately calls it. Now, past this, there's another big common step. That is Agile. right? Agile actually revolutionized the way we do work, revolutionized the way BAs do work, revolutionized the way developers do work, right? So lean and agile is the next sort of major step, which gave birth to things like product, and when I say product, I mean product designers on the design side and product owners on the business side, right? So this is a quick primer on the history. So as you can see, it's not quite as black and white as us being very new and business being very old. We actually existed in parallel quite a bit, but what happened with the invention of the microprocessor, people initially put a lot of stock into business analysis skills because the technology just didn't exist to support a wide proliferation of design quite yet, right? At that point, hardware was the main differentiator, software became the main differentiator about 10 years later, and then design is becoming sort of the main differentiator in the business world today. Now, as I mentioned before, the first BA Book of Knowledge was created in 2005, and that was sort of inspired by the Project Management Book of Knowledge. So if any of you are project managers or are aware of project management, they have sort of the Project Management Bible, the way they call it. But the definition of business analyst, for those of you who are not business analysts, in the second version of the BA Book of Knowledge, which was published in 2009, is this. And the important thing is to remember here is what that first definition talked about is working with stakeholders to understand an organization and to recommend solutions, right? That was what BAs initially considered the scope of their work. Now, when you look at version 3 of the BA Book of Knowledge, the definition changed quite significantly, and as a designer, right, I see design in there, right? I'm like, oh, interesting. You know, I wonder what made them change their mind. They are starting a little bit to sort of step on our territory here, right? And I know some of this is related to designing the business, but some of it is quite related to things like service design that are kind of our side of the field. Now, what do business analysts do? On a project team, they typically work on requirements, right? Some version of coming up with requirements. That means things like business flows, conceptual models, use cases, user stories, and so on. These are functional requirements. These are things that define what needs to be built. There's also something called non-functional requirements. And again, this might be very basic for some of you. Just bear with me for about 5 minutes. Non-functional requirements in the first version of the BA Book of Knowledge were listed as some of these things. Now, when I first looked at the BA Book of Knowledge, I think it was like 2005, 2006, I was really happy to see usability there because I was having quite a hard time at, working with BAs in that sort of decade. When I talked to them about, hey, let me do my work, let me sort of take the lead on the design side, they'd be like, well, we would, but that's our responsibility. And they would sort of push this into my face, right? Say, hey, here, it's in the Bible of our discipline, it shows that we are responsible for this stuff. And I asked them a simple question. I said, okay, so let's look at those non-functional requirements. Who does any of those things? You actually don't do it yourself. You actually go and you get experts that go in and write those chapters. It doesn't really matter where the documentation sits, but you're not actually the one coming up with all this stuff. You're actually getting somebody else to do it. I said, how come, when you look at usability, you guys are the ones that are kind of fight to be in charge of it? So not a good thing. BA Book of Knowledge number 2, usability disappeared. So in 2009, when sort of the first revised version of it came out, there was no mention of usability anymore. And at that point, UX were just kind of starting on a sort of big upward spiral. And I was really confused about why is it that user experience doesn't quite have a presence. But there's this new thing called operability. And when I look at the definition of it, you can read it on the screen. That's actually a pretty good definition of UX, if you ask me, right? It's not quite there, but So I was like, okay, you know what? I don't care. I don't care if they don't call it the right thing, as long as they're aware of it, right? Now, BA Book of Knowledge version 3, which came out last year, the actual size of the book jumped from about 270 pages to about 520 pages. So I was excited. I was like, wow, there's going to be like hundreds of pages of design in there. It's perfect. They're going to be aware of what we do. And when I look at the table of contents, usability is back. So I was like, okay, well, it's not called user experience, but I'll take usability. When I looked at the definition, this is the only mention of it. Of the 520 pages, this is like, it's basically a paragraph about wee big, and this is what they say. I read that, and I'm like, okay, well, that's the definition of learnability. So they still don't get it. So why is it that they don't get it? I mean, you guys come to our design conferences. We go, or some of us go to sort of BA and project management conferences. We've been trying to explain to you guys for a very long time what it is that we do, and somehow we're just kind of not getting through, right? Like at least in the official channels of the International Institute of Business Analysis, they don't quite understand where BA is. And then I started talking to people as to why don't they understand what we do? And then I found things like this, right? So when we go to design conferences, this is what we tell people that we do. And I mean, this is a design conference, and most of us are designers, but the BAs that are in this audience, when they see this stuff, they have a good laugh, and they go and they take a picture of it, right? And then they take it back to their work, and they say, this is what designers do, and they show this to their bosses and their stakeholders and senior management. And senior management looks at this and goes like, oh my God, I don't want design in there. Like this is not how I want to work with people. I don't want to work with people who work like this. We also do things like this, right? So this is Daniel Newman's famous sort of design squiggle, right, where it says that, when I design something, I sort of restrict the problem space smaller and smaller until I actually come out to the other side with the right solution. And a lot of people really feel that this is the way they do work, right? If this is how you do work, I don't want you to work for me, ever, right? I actually subscribe to things like Bill Buxton's a way of designing things, which is more related of systematically exploring alternatives and sort of narrowing down the space and making decisions focusing on lateral ideation, right? But this is sort of a decision tree that kind of I use when I design something, right? This is something that the business, who typically have an analytic mind, they can actually understand. They can actually figure out that, we're not just kind of going willy-nilly. We actually have a process. We're actually measuring things. We're actually talking to people to sort of navigate this decision tree. If I were to ask you what your definition of UX design is, right, and if somebody from the outside of the design community would ask you what that is, I guarantee you that, I don't know how many people are here, like 300 people, there will probably be about 50 definitions. Do you guys agree? Right? That's another problem, right? We're not really able to define our discipline. And funny enough, I've been pretty successful for the past 15 plus years using the same definition. So even though I might sound redundant, I'm going to show you what that is. This is what I tell people that I do. The reason for that is it actually explains, almost like to a child, what is every single step that I do in order to complete a project. So I tell people this is an evidence-based methodology. That's actually really important. It's going to have to do with the squiggle, it's not to do with me swearing off in front of the computer. I actually try to come up with evidence for my designs. I involve end users throughout the creative process, right? And I'm trying to do research, which is the identify, conceptualize, and design part, to create services or products that are measurably easier to use, learn, and remember. When I put this in front of a non-designer, designers look at this and go like, oh yeah, it's obvious. Totally makes sense. And I know that. But when you put this in front of a non-designer, they actually start reading this, and it starts registering to them that what we do is not some sort of artistic decoration process. We're actually using a pretty solid methodology that a lot of smart people have worked on. So thank you for kind of bearing with me on that. When we look at designers and business analysts, we do quite a few different things, and I know that this list could go on for like 5 or 6 screens, right? I'm not going to sort of subject you to that. But there's also a lot of overlap, right? So some of these techniques in the middle, we are doing them as designers, BAs do them as BAs, and sometimes they're mandated for them to do, sometimes they're not. But the point is, you know, when we as managers or when we as team leads get designers to work with a BA, there's a really important lesson to be learned here. It's much better to get them to work on things that they both are aware of and they both know, so that they can build that relationship and they can understand each other's biases, right? As Ruth was saying earlier, right? Triangulating bias, right? Triangulating research so that you can eliminate bias. We have our own design bias, they have their own sort of business bias, but I think getting them to work together, and this has worked for me in my career, got them on the same page much quicker than working in a separate silo. Now, when I was responding to an RFP a couple of years ago with a friend of mine, and I think it was a government RFP. People tend to bastardize a lot of the methods that we're using, right? So when I say you guys should work together with business analysts, whether it's researchers, whether it's designers and so on, try not to mix those techniques and try not to bastardize them. This is actually quite important, right? If you're a purist, if you're a researcher, you see this and you cringe, right? If you're a designer, you should be cringing as well. And if you're a BA, I don't know what you'll feel, but I think it's pretty funny. Another thing that we have is common models. So one of the big things in the BA Book of Knowledge version 3 is the introduction of the business model canvas, which is a way of generating business models. That was quite successful for the business world. And as a result, the experience design world came up with their own sort of version, which is called the experience canvas. How many of you are familiar with the experience canvas? Cool, a few of them. So Atlassian is the company that came up with it, which is a way of generating and validating design hypotheses, right? So I've used it in a couple of projects, actually quite interesting to show that to the business because they understand sort of how this model works. There's a company in Poland called the Rectangles, and they came out last year with another model based on the Canvas model called the user-centered design canvas, which I'm not quite as familiar with as the experience canvas, but you guys can look that up as well. It's called, again, the company's called the Rectangles. So there's a lot of overlap in what we do. You may or may not be aware of, but the Usability Professional Association in 2010 actually tried to create the Usability Book of Knowledge. So we tried to sort of copy what project managers have done, what BAs have done, and try to kind of apply that to the user experience and usability world. However, that effort kind of went nowhere because as we all know, we're really not good at agreeing on things, right? So that's things that we have in common, but we also have things that are different. The most obvious one is that BAs typically focus more on the needs of stakeholders, and designers focus more on the needs of users, right? But this is sort of the baseline of it all. If we look at the typical career path of a BA, right, they tend to work on an industry or maybe a couple of related industries. So if somebody works in financial services, their entire sort of career will be spent typically on financial services, on insurance or investing, but they get rewarded for that fidelity, right? They get rewarded by building subject matter expertise within a particular industry. They also get higher salaries and seniority and all the benefits that come with that. If you're a designer, we're quite different, right? We get rewarded for industrial promiscuity, if you want to call it that way, right? We get rewarded for working across many types of industries on many types of products and being able to bring concepts from one into another and actually trying to be agents of change. This is something that, again, if you're a team lead or if you have a practice, it's nice to show this to the people that are outside of your practice to make them understand why we have these crazy ideas, right? We actually have not been sort of stuck in the same sort of trenches for 10, 20, 30, 40 plus years. We actually like to diversify and try to amalgamate concepts from different things. But just because, we're sensible people doesn't mean that there is no conflict, right? As you all know, conflict is sort of a way of life when it comes to working with the business, when it comes to working with the development team. I don't mean conflict as like physical conflict. I just mean sort of, having nice verbal arguments. So how do we bypass that, right, as designers? There was a study at Google that was released last year that took 7 years, and people asked, Google employees, what's the right traits that you look into your colleagues, right? Like, if you want to pick your team, what is it that you're looking up to your, in the way your colleagues work? What do you admire about them that makes them worthy to be in your team? And they use things like expertise and emotional intelligence and camaraderie and so on. The answer was actually niceness. People really don't care about all this other stuff. All they care about is working with nice people, right? So we as designers, we think of ourselves as really nice people. When we talk to our users, we're sort of very empathic and we listen to their point of view, and we try to understand, spend a lot of time understanding what it is that they're doing. But when we work with our teams, our counterparts, we're not actually doing the same thing. We're actually quite confrontational in some cases, right? We're very biased toward defending our designs. So one important lesson to have here is treat your team the way you treat your users, right? I think that's actually one of the most important slides in this presentation, right? If you treat your team the way you treat your users, you will actually get much farther, much quicker in making decisions. Speaking of making decisions, how do we make decisions? How do we make business decisions with business analysts, right? If we have different opinions, how do we win that argument, right? So this part is sort of the anatomy of a business decision, or the anatomy of a design decision as we look at it. Now, Ben and Gareth, I think earlier on, they kind of had some Star Wars up on the screen. I'm gonna do my own Star Wars version here. I've done this a couple of times in my life. When we had some research meetings, and after research meetings, I said, okay, I will go back to my desk, talk to my team, figure out what our takeaways are, and we'll come up with some sort of initial sketches to kind of see how we address this problem. And we were planning on, taking 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day, whatever it takes to sort of go through our process. And 50 minutes later, the BA comes in with like a napkin and says, oh, I got it. This is it. Here's the design. Trust me, I'm a subject matter expert. I know how it's done. And I got it, I looked at it, and I said, you know what, this is not the designs you're looking for. I said nothing. Look at them. They look back at me. I don't know what it is, so my Jedi mind tricks are obviously not quite as advanced as I thought that they are. So I said, okay, so this technique may not work quite as well as I thought. Technique number 2. How many of you are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect? Awesome. So David Dunning and Justin Kruger are 2 psychologists at Cornell University, and they won the Nobel Prize in the year 2000 for proving that the less experience, knowledge, or familiarity somebody has with a particular concept, the less likely they are to recognize their own incompetence. It's funny, it sounds like a comedic slide, but it's not. So I've been quite successful, working with my counterpart BAs, not going higher up necessarily in the ranks with this, but when they come to me and they're very confident about a particular design piece, I say, well, cool, let me show you something, right? So this is valid stuff. This is a study that's won the Nobel Prize. Where do you think you are on this line? When they look at it, they go like, okay, how about, okay, so maybe you go and you do your version and then we talk about it, and we're we're starting a bit of dialogue because of this, right? But it doesn't always work, and especially if you're working with somebody higher up the ladder, this may not be successful. But it's a tool. How many of you are familiar with the design validation stack? So this is something that Kenneth Bowles and James Fox introduced in a book called Undercover User Experience in 2010. And this is the first time, when I saw this, I incorporated this in sort of my toolbox immediately because it feels that this is the absolute right way of making or validating our decisions as designers, right? So this is a simple 3-level stack. The first level stack is related to design theory. So things like, design elements like line, shape, color, typography, etc. Then we have design principles, things like proximity and contrast and so on. And then we have design laws, things like Fitts law, etc. That's the sort of lowest level that we design decisions, that we validate decisions on. Then we have a second level that's related to research. So when we go do research, we do our contextual inquiries, we do our ethnography, we do our focus groups, we do whatever, all the stuff that good researchers do. That's sort of a supporting layer to that base layer of design theory, right? And then there's a third layer called the user evidence layer that's related to actual metrics, usability testing results. So these are sort of real physical world arguments for, making a design decision. When I showed this to BAs, I said, hey, this is how I make my decisions, right? How do you guys make your decisions? And they said, well, we don't have anything like that. So I said, okay, let's sit down and figure out how you guys make your decisions. And as we sit down, they say, oh, we got 3 layers too. We got a business theory layer, we got a business research layer, and we have an evidence layer. So there you go, stalemate. And I'm like, okay, what is it that you guys, what's in each of those layers? And funny enough, it actually holds. Business theory, they have sort of the key concept, techniques, and principles that sort of make up business decisions from a design perspective, so things like efficiency, process streamlining, and so on. They have business research, so they have things like chat sessions, focus groups, right? So they do their own sort of type of research. And then they have an evidence layer, which is related to user acceptance testing, and then they have process metrics, right? So when you look at it, it kind of feels like it's a bit of a stalemate. But let's take a closer look at each of these layers. Oops. Too much. At the theoretical layer, right, we have what is called a deductive level logic argument. So when we try to make decisions or we're trying to sort of piece this together and win that design argument, this is a layer where we're not going to win necessarily a whole lot of arguments, even though some of the things that we're going to bring up are actually quite valid. Because we could start from 2 different points that are valid and come up to two completely different conclusions, right? So sometimes this is not going to get you further. And you say, okay, well, if the business theory layer or the design theory layer is not quite useful, what is it useful for? So things like colors, right? So if you want to decide on a color, and the business team comes in and says, well, we've been using this color and it's been sort of working really well for the past 10 years. You can bring up color theory and say, well, according to color theory, there's reasons why you should be able to change this. This might or might not work. So we move on to the next layer, right? The user research layer. We go and we talk to users, they talk to users, they talk to stakeholders, and we come up with 2 different conclusions. How do we win that argument? Well, even though it looks like, it's not a stalemate, there's something there that's not quite obvious that makes quite a big difference in winning this design argument at this level. So when people do research, they typically ask people ask users or stakeholders to verbalize needs. In the case of business analysts, they typically ask to verbalize needs as part of formal conversation. So people participate with their guards up, they're skeptical, they're critical, and people can stop themselves from retaining facts when they're doing this formal conversations. When we talk to users, we tend, like when we're really driven into using story-based conversation. And the interesting thing about that, there was a study in Fast Company last year, is that stories are much easier to synthesize and people can't stop themselves from even remembering the facts. So the type of research that we gather is actually more valuable than the type that they gather through formal conversation. But let's say that's not winning the argument. So there's another layer here, which is the user evidence layer. So we have, our usability testing results. We have our sort of metrics. They have their own. Sorry, am I going too fast here? Oops. Okay, sorry, my bad. So they have their sort of user acceptance testing. But if you think about it, when you do this, they should arrive to the same conclusion. If you do user acceptance testing, if you do usability testing on the same products, the results are the same. But the big thing here, and this is something that you can present to business leadership, is that there's a time delay. There's a delta there between the time that we can do usability testing and there's the time that they can do user acceptance testing. And that is sort of the biggest thing why, if we have somehow managed to do usability testing, that should win us the argument pretty much any time, because that saves them time, that saves them money. And if you show this to an executive, they will likely give you a chance to go and design things the way you want to. And now the last slide, making projections. So how do you know when you work with BAs that you're going to be on a successful project? And I looked at different things like, I went back to some of the projects that I worked in my entire sort of career, and I looked at what are the constraints. So sometimes there were things like financial constraints, budget, there were like resourcing constraints, there were time constraints, but it actually didn't make a huge difference in the way the projects were successful or not. But the one thing that made a huge difference was the hiring delay between the lead designer and the lead UXer on the project. So being able to sort of understand problems together and try to solve problems together from the beginning, and avoiding that sort of alpha BA, it's what I call the alpha BA syndrome, where you have a BA that's been there for a year and thinks that they know everything, is actually a good way of alleviating some of this stuff. This is Paul Sherman earlier on. He was talking about the typical UX grouping skills. I would add business analysis to that as sort of going forward. And then the absolute last slide. As I was talking about earlier on where this UX discipline is going and where business analysis is going, these are 8 of the top 10 management consulting companies last year, right? We're all familiar with, Capital One acquiring Adaptive Path and Facebook acquiring, Hot Studio and all these acquisitions. But I'm not sure if you guys are aware that management consulting companies, which typically hire BAs, have been buying design companies like crazy. This is a very small list. I just don't have time, and I don't have enough space and time to actually put this on the slides. So there's a convergence that's happening right now. So rather than becoming ninjas and rock stars and unicorns and all this kind of stuff, maybe the way our discipline is going forward is actually as a convergence between the BA and UX role in the near future. So thank you very much.